Hi everyone, for today's lesson we are going to extend our learning on side by actually completing some proofwriting. Before you get started with this lesson, please make sure that you have something to write with and some colors, but also please make sure that you have completed the day 3 discussion notes over all of the different ways to prove triangles congruent, as well as information about side. So to recap on side, if you can show that 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to 3 sides of another triangle, you can show that, then you can prove that the 2 triangles are congruent by side, otherwise called SSS. So that's exactly what we're going to do here in this proof. So looking at what we are given in this problem, we are told that segment WX is congruent to segment YX. For all proofs, whatever is given to you, the expectation is that you are going to mark up your picture. So I'm going to mark up that WX is congruent to YX. So I'm going to mark up that information. Next, I'm told that Z is the midpoint of segment WY. So I don't know what this is right here, but it's congruent to segment WY. So let's think about what we know about midpoints. Midpoints cuts a segment or divides a segment in half into 2 congruent pieces. So because I know that Z is the midpoint of WY, I know that it's going to divide this segment into 2 congruent pieces. So now we need to come up with our third congruence. So far I have a side, and since this lesson's called side, I need a third side. And that third side is going to come from XZ. Both of these triangles share XZ, and because they share XZ, I can use the reflexive property of congruence to say that XZ is congruent to segment, well, let's verify. Looking at my statement, I have XZ and XZ, so I would say XZ would be congruent to XZ. It's always important for you to pay attention to what your order of the letters are supposed to be. And this reflexive property of congruence is something that I'm expecting you to know how to mark up. I'm also expecting you to know how to mark up whenever you see that word midpoint. So hopefully everybody has, for some of you it might be a different color, but hopefully everyone has these properties for the wording of our proofs, because these are all of the boxes that we are going to have. So it just depends on what kind of situation that we have. So we're going to be using these boxes in just a moment. Looking at my first statement, we always write down what is given. And I'm going to write that WX is congruent to segment YX. And I'm going to say that Z is the midpoint of WY. And we write this because it is given. The next thing that we talked about was the midpoint. We marked up the yellow information. And we know that a midpoint cuts a segment in half. So I'm going to go to my boxes and I see the word midpoint. And so I have a couple of pieces, a couple of if-then statements, and we need to decide which one is most appropriate. Number 3 says, if a point is a midpoint, then it divides a segment into 2 congruent segments. Number 4 says, if a point divides a segment into 2 congruent segments, then it is a midpoint. So we need to decide which if-then statement is going to be appropriate, because I know that if Z is the midpoint, then that means that WZ is congruent to YZ. But why can we say that those segments are congruent to each other? Well, what came before was midpoint. What came next was congruent segments. So I'm going to be working with if a point is a midpoint, then it divides a segment into two congruent segments. If you want to use shorthand, that's perfectly fine with me. So I'm going to say if a point is a midpoint, then it divides a segment into two congruent segments. So I said that WZ is congruent to YZ. You could have said ZW is congruent to ZY, as long as you're matching up your statement based on what we're trying to prove. And we're trying to prove that triangle WXZ is congruent to triangle YXZ. So now my last statement is I came up so far with one side being congruent. Now another side is being congruent, and I like to put up at the top what I'm trying to prove these triangles are congruent by. And so far I have shown two sides are congruent, and now I need to talk about the third side. And that third side comes from the reflexive property of congruence that says that XZ is going to be congruent to itself. So I have XZ is congruent to XC. And I say this because of the reflexive property of congruence. So there's my side, side, side. So once I have all of my S's marked up, I can now end my proof by saying WXZ has to be congruent to triangle YXZ by side, side, side. Let's go ahead and try that again. This time around, we're looking at our new proof, and in this proof, let's mark up our information. First of all, I have IJ is congruent to HK, so I'm going to mark that up in my picture. Then I have segment IH is congruent to segment JK. So far I have two sides that are congruent, and since this is the side, side, side lesson, I know I'm going to prove this triangle, these two triangles, triangle HIJ being congruent to triangle JKH by side, side, side. So I need another side, and that other side once again is going to come from the fact that these two triangles share side JH. So because they share side JH, I get to use the reflexive property of congruence. Now this is the part that's tricky. Am I going to say that JH is congruent to JH or HJ? Well, let's go to our statement. Looking at our statement, it looks like H matches with J and J matches with H. So therefore, instead of me saying JH is congruent to JH, I'm going to say that JH is congruent to HJ. So that is part of my thinking and showing my thinking before getting started with my proof. So let's go ahead and write down what's given to us. I have IJ is congruent to HK, and I have segment IH is congruent to segment JK, and I write this because it is given. And what I was given was actually two S's. And now I need my third S, my third side. And once again, that's going to come from JH being congruent to HJ. And that was because of the reflexive property of congruence. There is my third S. And now that I have all of my S's checked off, I can finish this proof by saying triangle HIJ is congruent to triangle JKH by side, side, side. So the thing that I need you guys to know about proof writing, especially once you get into your homework, is that when two triangles have a shared side, it will not be listed in the given information. It will not be listed in the given information. Instead, it is going to be your responsibility to see it and include it in your proof as the reflexive property of congruence. So I want you guys to just be aware of that. There's going to be a lot of problems where it's going to be your responsibility to mark up your picture, and reflexive property of congruence is one of those things that I need you to absolutely have marked up on your picture. That is the end of this lesson. If you guys have any questions over anything I showed you, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day.